afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, whatever it may be. My name is Meredith Dixon. I am an educational program coordinator with the Hawaii, and so I'm excited to see you all here today joining us for this presentation. Just a couple quick housekeeping things, again, as we let folks in from the waiting room. This webinar is being recorded, and so we will get it posted to the Hawaii YouTube channel next week if folks want to revisit this or share it out. And we also encourage throughout the webinar today the use of the chat. So if you have questions or thoughts that come, feel free to pop those in the chat. We will keep an eye on those. And we will also hold some time at the end of the presentation to address some of those questions as well. So with that, as I said, I'll continue to let folks in from the waiting room as we go on, but I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Shaun Crisler, who has a variety of experiences in higher education, including currently serving as the Associate Provost for Student Development at Moyne College in New York. And so Shaun wrote last year a three-piece article for Hawaii's Talking Stick magazine that explored the idea of a path to leadership. And so that's kind of the jumping off point for today. To give Shaun a platform to share the lessons he learned in that, his own lessons in his own career. And so if you haven't seen the article, I'll be putting the link in the chat here shortly. But with that, I will turn things over to Shaun.
All right. Well, thanks, Meredith. So first, I just want to say I'm glad everyone was able to make it. I know this is being recorded, and so for those who show up late, we have a chance to support you. And so again, I'm Shaun Crisler. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And our time today, we'll be talking about charting a path for leadership, the invisible conversation. And what I want to do is use the chat function. At certain points, I'll ask questions of you in the chat function, and you can respond there. And then we'll spend our time together kind of working through this. And so what I want to start off with a really clear background of my work. So probably like many of you, I grew up in residence life. And for me, it was very clear very early that housing residence life was for me. And I think much of it had to do with it really aligned with the spiritual calling for me to serve and to be of service to students and professionals. And as I've moved through the profession from student staff member to professional, I found it to be rewarding, exhausting, challenging, and difficult. And so like many senior housing professionals and leaders who've come before me in this path, my path continues to be filled with success, failure, disappointment, uncertainty, imposter syndrome, depression, racism, and faith. And those are just some of the things that I named when you're talking about moving forward as a senior leader. As we speak today, I realize that our time is condensed. And so even though we have an hour, I probably could spend a lot of time talking about individual points. And so I'm going to do my best. And as we think about this, I want to share that probably over the course of the last 5 to 7 years, a lot of what I'm going to share with you, I've pulled from interviews, from interviewing probably over 90 professionals to inquire about their leadership path, their trajectory, their competencies, their identities. And so I think you'll see parts of that in our conversation today. And so instead of so much maybe telling you what to do or giving you advice or just distilling lessons learned, I want to use our time together to simply invite you into a conversation and give you some things and steps to consider. And so with that, let's begin. I want to give you an overview of some points that we'll talk about today. So we're going to talk about this piece about starting your path. We're going to talk about mentorship. We're going to move into competencies, professional development, a professional home, and leadership brand. And there probably was 20 or so that I could have selected, but what I tried to do was select the ones that mostly came out of themes from interviews that I've hosted. So with that, let's start with the starting your path and have you ask yourself the question. So I want to begin there. So this question of how do I know this path for senior leadership is right for me, is the question that many of the professionals that I've interviewed and spoken with wrestle with internally. It was clear that that was a starting point. And you don't answer this question one time. There were a number of professionals who answered this question and reflected on it year after year. But I found it to be a secret question, if you will, for those who were senior housing professionals. And I say it was a secret because when I'm not interviewing professionals, often I'm coaching. And sometimes I'll meet professionals who are in a phase and they say they're stuck and they want to move into a senior housing role. What I found is sometimes with those professionals, they haven't begun with the question of how do I begin this and internally wrestle with that. And the question sounds simple enough, but it's really complex for two reasons. First, when you think about how do I know that the path for senior leadership is right for me, those two reasons are first, the higher you seem to rise in senior leadership as a senior housing officer, you'll find that there are no straight lines, lit paths. Sometimes there's no training or even clear support. And so it's most certainly filled with learning curves, steep challenges, and even self-doubt. And so the beauty of this question is that if you're able to wrestle with it, of how do I know that this path is the right for me, then you have essentially officially begun. And so for those of you who've asked yourself this question and you're working on it, then I say welcome. For those of you who maybe hesitated to ask yourself this question, I encourage you to write it down and when you're ready to take a leap of faith and join us. As we think about this, here are some of the pieces that again come out. There are few straight paths, and that's important because some of the information that I'll share today is not about one path or even my path, but what it is about are the themes that have come up in a number of paths that I've had a chance to watch. There are few guardrails, a lot of learning curves. The level of responsibility in these roles is extraordinarily high. For some of us, it might be the most responsible or accountable we've ever had to be for a large group of people. There's external partnerships, internal pressures, and political dynamics. So all of these things are the pieces that make you ask yourself this question. And this is what a lot of professionals really wrestle with. So that's the starting point. Now let's move on to mentorship. So in the chat, if you can, how many of you have a mentor? And you can just put it in the chat, have a mentor, working on it. But how many of you have a mentor? I'm just going to click on my chat function and move it over. But how many of you have a mentor? Okay, see a few responses. Okay. Okay. All right, one formally working on it. Okay, so this piece around mentorship, in our work, is probably one of the clearest lines for those who've answered this question and decided that and you'll hear me go between saying a senior housing officer and saying a senior leader, and I do that just to demonstrate that part of that sometimes that path of becoming a senior housing officer is that some have gone on to be vice presidents or even presidents, and so I go back and forth to just acknowledge that I don't cap this information just to stop at a senior housing officer. But when we think about mentorship, sometimes we think about that as one person or maybe even two. But what I found was that in talking to professionals, a number of them had multiple mentors. And so this became a reoccurring theme that it just wasn't one. It continued to come up that they had multiple ones. And part of that reason was a number of them said that they realized very early that they couldn't do it by themselves. And so for some people, the professional metric, when they got into these senior housing positions, or even on the way up, I should say, so maybe not in the position, but on the way up, is that the metric of success was that they would do it all by themselves. As they would figure it out, they would have the answer. And many of them started to burn themselves out, they found the weight of their roles somewhat heavy, and they began to realize that this ideal on their path to being a senior housing officer was really wrapped in their ego of thinking that they could do it all, and that what was really important was that they were competent in everything. And that just wasn't the case. And so I want to begin to kind of talk about this piece around mentorship and who's on your mentor board. And so I want to shift it here. So in this diagram, it shows you an example of a board table. And I did this for myself, and I constantly update this behind the scenes. But I want you to think about this. So in the center is you, and for this case, it's me. And you'll notice that there's a sponsor, department, division. You see a coach, a people connector, a peer, old institution sponsor, topical mentor, political astuteness, new seasoned professional, same institution mentor. And so the reason I use this diagram is because in these interviews, not only did professionals have a mentor, but they also had a mentor, sometimes a coach, and sometimes a sponsor. And those three seem to be the formula. The mentor was there to provide support and guidance, where the coach took on a different role. The coach was there to provide feedback, to create game plans in terms of different situations. And then you had the sponsor, which was a person who was in the mix, working to remove barriers, if you will. And so in this, I decided that I would give you an example of my own mentorship board and a little bit about how other professionals who were moving through the ranks were really using this. So for myself, you'll notice that there is a people connector somewhere towards the bottom. One of the things that I knew very early on as a professional that I noticed is that it helps to be connected with people. And I know people call that a network. And I know that at times, as much as I can put myself out there, I have found there are much better people who can connect with people easily. And so for me, when we talk about that, I always have found that having a people connector, someone who knows me, but knows a great deal of other people and is willing to bring me into those circles, has helped me greatly. You also will see outside institution sponsor. Sometimes for me, the political dynamics of my institution have been difficult, and I've needed an outside person, maybe who was a little senior than me, who could hear about that situation and give me a sense, but also could remove barriers for opportunities and professional development that wasn't tied to the institution. You also notice you see a new seasoned professional. I try to work to be mentored by a new seasoned professional because it gives me an opportunity to understand what's happening in the field. Even though this is my board, a lot of this formula I actually pulled from a number of professionals that I interviewed who were moving up the ranks and talked to me about how they use mentorship. On the left, you'll see me ask some pretty direct questions. Who will coach you? Who will sponsor you? Who will mentor you, and who will walk you through your blind spots? And so that is an important concept. And so if you haven't considered having a group of people who are solely invested in not only you being successful, but also people who are personally invested in your hopes, in your growth, and on your pathway to senior leadership. And so this is something to consider. So I want to ask, how many of you have heard of a mentor board? And so put that in the chat. How many of you have heard of this? All right. Okay. Got a few. Okay. All right. Got a few. So when you think about this, I want to add one more point to this. When you think about this mentor board, there were various levels of it. And what stood out to me was that even though we're using the word mentor, a number of professionals commented on their way up, and when they had finally made it to a senior housing position, they expressed at times how lonely it was. and that there wasn't always a place for them to connect with other professionals. They're leading a large department, some for the very first time. Sometimes their spouses didn't want to hear about the work. Sometimes they didn't have a safe place. And so what was interesting was a number of professionals had this mentor board that either grew over time with the same people, maybe they changed some people out, or it stayed consistent, and those people had the luxury and the privilege of watching that person's career move up and coach them and support them. But remember, definitely an option. Now, something that I want to tease out, I tried to pull out as many of the, as you will, secrets in that I kind of want to point out. So some of the things that I had to pull out of these interviews were some of the dynamics when you talk about a mentor board. So one of the first pieces that I was able to capture was that if you're not good at building positive, sustainable relationships, this part may be difficult, because this mentor board requires a commitment on your behalf, but it also requires a commitment on their behalf as relates to time and energy. And so these relationships are not transactional relationships. These relationships are people who are invested in you and willing to support you, but they're not transactional. And so if you are able to make these relationships, you're not going to probably want to invite those on your mentor board who might have a transactional nature, or simply a fancy title who impresses you, because again, you need them to be invested in you. One of the characteristics for me on those who I invite on my mentor board is, one, to ask, but two, they have to be incredibly patient. They have to be patient. Partly is because I ask a lot of questions, and some of the feedback that I'm often given, it can take me days to weeks to months to sometimes understand the best course of action. So they need to be patient. The second thing is that you also have to have something to offer. And it might not be as much as they're offering you, but this is not one directional. So it's not the sage person kind of giving you wisdom. It's two directional. And so you also want to be able to bring things to the conversation as well. The third thing I was able to kind of pull out was that it takes time to build this board. It takes time. What's important to notice is that you are not collecting people. That is not what this is about. So the goal is to build these relationships and to theoretically build a smaller community in which you can learn and contribute. And so that is different than a network when we talk about this. The other pieces that what I found to be interesting, pulling this up behind the scenes, is that as much as your supervisor possibly could be a mentor, they might not be the best mentor for you. And so don't be disappointed when you're moving through the ranks through these senior positions, that perhaps your supervisor is not the one. Two other points before we kind of move on. You don't want to select this group by title or some simple metric of success. You want to select them based on alignment in your path in terms of knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so, for example, again, anyone who is sitting on my board, I've tried to pull them in, share with them my goals, and ask them directly so they can help me with that. And lastly, there's a Chinese proverb that says, "Talk doesn't cook rice." And this just reminds me to share with you that as you're talking about people who you want to either coach you, sponsor you, or mentor you, that there's this piece that thinking and planning and wondering, there's a part where that becomes unhelpful. And so you need folks who are about being into action and being into action with you and thinking about that. So with that, let's shift if we can, and I want to talk about some resources that you might consider. And again, so the first one is 8 mentors. Which one do you need? The strategic guide to shaping your student affairs career, finding the sponsor, now the mentor, and who's on your mentor board. And these are not just the only guides, but I think what these do when you're talking about being on a path to becoming a senior leader is they help you be proficient at the art of the mentor support relationship. That was really clear in talking to professionals who had theoretically really found a way to harness the power and support of people. And so if we just take a large step back from this, maybe a 30,000-foot view, we've moved from kind of talking about mentoring and you being the object to moving to a place at a 30,000 view where we're saying that you're also preparing yourself to be a mentor, a sponsor, or a guide for those who are coming. So when you're in the senior housing role, you can do the same thing. And so a different dynamic there. So moving from you being the object and moving to you being able to serve in a different capacity. Okay, so at this point, we've covered starting your path, and we talked about how do I know that this path for senior leadership is right for me. We went into mentorship. Who's on your mentorship board? And now I want to talk about competencies. Competencies was a really strong theme in the conversations with a number of professionals, and so you must be willing to not only invest in yourself but hone your knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so let's talk about that for a little bit. The Cool Eye curriculum is probably one of the most valuable tools that you can use in your path to becoming a senior housing officer for these particular reasons. It identifies knowledge, skills, and understanding that every housing and residence life professional should have. It's focused on individuals and not the association, and it's progressive. And so the core curriculum identifies these pieces that you want to know and that you need to know. And so when you think about these competencies and how this might mean, there are some pieces that came up as I did these interviews and as I worked with professionals where they talked about using these competencies. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest challenges that I found, again, when professionals started to note that they were stuck or they were having a problem, was that they either decided that they could go into the competencies, read them, but they weren't sure quite how to apply them, or they attempted to apply them, but they decided that they struggled with the commitment of that. And so when you think about this, these competencies play a big role, partly because also too, there's this secret piece in here, at least I think it's secret, because it was hard to call out in the interviews, but there's this piece where we talk about having an understanding of housing as a generalist, in addition to the expertise in an individual role. One of the things that came out in these interviews was that not only were professionals proficient on their way to becoming a senior housing officer, but they had taken a leap of faith to commit themselves to some pretty specific expertise areas. And what that meant was that when they went into applying for these senior housing roles, they found that they might be pulled in because they had great marketing or communication. It might be assessment or evaluation, or it might be a combination of facilities and operations or financial management. And so almost all of them had 1 to 3 really strong areas and competencies where they had either decided to get additional schooling in, additional certificates through a core eye or other areas, or additional focus points. And so it wasn't just having a understanding of the competencies or the curriculum. It was also taking this leap of faith to focus their skill sets on some really particular areas. So for example, using my own experience, my focus has been human resources and strategic planning probably for some time. And I went on to finish human resources. So I have a master's in human resources. That is the lens that I bring to a number of conversations about housing, residence life staff, or to other senior meetings. And so it was very clear that a number of these professionals had made a leap and not only understood the core curriculum broadly, because you can't master them all, but they did decide to choose and focus on some areas where they could master themselves and grow. So how many of you have seen the Akua core curriculum? Either you've taken a look at it or you're familiar with it. Put that in the chat if you can. How many of you are familiar with it and you've seen it? Okay, so when you think about this, one of the things that's great about that core curriculum is that it has this trajectory attached to it. Now, if you think about this, some of the professionals that I've been working with, they got these documents and they looked at them. But what was interesting was they struggled to figure out how they were going to apply some of these pieces within their work. And so when you think about this, here's some questions that I would like to offer. Some of those questions involve which competencies come naturally to you, which competencies are a challenge, which competencies have learning curves that require an invitation. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Which competencies require a coach, a mentor, or a sponsor, and which competencies allow you to lead yourself, lead others, and lead organizations. And so if we just break that down, if we think about which competencies come naturally to us, sometimes I give professionals an exercise where they look at these competencies that come naturally to them. Perhaps it's finance, or for me, it was human resources. They spend time in that competency and they begin to share with me how there's alignment between the work that they do and that competency, and begin to kind of craft a plan for how they will meet other areas of that metrics. The second one is competencies are a challenge. For me, for the longest, it was around occupancy management. And so realizing that was a challenge, working with professionals who would give me an opportunity to sit up close and center. And a number of professionals talked about this in the interviews, that for competencies in the curriculum for Core I that were challenges, they directly went and found and spent hours with a number of professionals who would constantly coach them and teach them. The last one, or I should say the third question of the five, is which competencies have learning curves require an invitation. When we think about the core competencies and we think about financial management or fiscal responsibility or fiscal control, some professionals had to work with the senior housing officer or the CFO, and based on sometimes a sponsor getting them into a meeting or being able to sit at the table, they were able to be present and participate in those meetings when maybe they otherwise would not have. And so that's why I say an invitation. So those are the questions that we can consider when we're thinking about that. I think the other thing to consider is that in talking to these professionals, the word that sticks out to me is home. Sometimes I think when we talk about the curriculum, the conversation that we might not be having is that it does require an investment of time and study. A number of professionals that moved from assistant director, from RD, all the way up to senior housing professional, they didn't always name it in conversation, but it was clear that they had honed their skills, their knowledge, and their abilities in either technique, in either skill, in either product, or either ideas. And what was clear to me is they had done this over a long period of time. That was kind of the secret sauce for a lot of them, is that they didn't just work on it, they continued to work on it until their expertise grew. And so when you think about a number of leading companies or leading organizations, they spend time in honing their skills for senior managers. And a number of these professionals talked about how they had to invest themselves, even when professional development wasn't available. All right. So with that, let's move into professional development a little bit, and let's talk about again this part about investing in yourself. And I want to give you some examples. So when we think about professional development, this is actually the professional development. It was part of it. The NHTI competencies, the National Housing Training Institute, has competencies. This originally was one for professional development. And what I did is I was working with professionals, is I did a research project on those competencies and I rewrote a number of them. This is an example of a professional development competency that I rewrote. And I want you to notice something here, is that you'll see that it moves from leading yourself to leading others to leading managers to leading the function to leading the organization. And I'm going to blow that up and show you that in just one moment. But I want to give you a frame for how I try to speak, or how others have spoke about professional development. And so here, and I'm going to read this, and it's framed in terms of an effective housing professional, because we're not just talking about those at the senior level, we're also talking about those who are moving up. And so basically, an effective housing professional keeps pace with the changing landscape in the field, creates paths of support for themselves and others towards the continued development of knowledge, skills, and abilities to serve better the needs of students, the department, and the institution. It goes on to say that these professionals put forth continued effort to form a vision for their career. They create plans for personal growth that support lifelong learning and development. They have a conceptual understanding of their role, functions, responsibilities, and its history in relation to the campus and the field. They use this information to navigate the dimensions of their position. They continually grow their knowledge, skills, and abilities through feedback, self awareness, reflection, and self assessment. They develop their KSAs through engagement and participation in conferences, workshops, seminars that broaden their exposure to thought leaders, research, resources, approaches, theories, and mental models. And lastly, they hone their knowledge, skills, and abilities through continuous learning, volunteer opportunities, mentorship, research and professional networks, and steady application of principles through simulations and case studies and role playing and action planning. Lastly, they acknowledge the professional development is an iterative process and journey of professional growth. Now, this definition I adapted and updated within the NHTI competency platform. And so I rewrote the definition because as I interview professionals, they were able to share with me what I put in this definition was a formula for professional development or a different way to consider it. And the biggest part was that it was an iterative process. This last frame that I want to share when we talk about professional development is around this leading yourself and leading others, leading managers, leading functions, and leading the organization. Sometimes when I was talking to professionals and even in my own journey, professionals could get lost in terms of they're going to conferences or they're working on professional development, but they're not quite sure where to put it. And so I've used this frame to not only coach professionals, but to give them a different type of maybe mental model when they're thinking about moving into senior housing roles. And so when you're thinking about this from this standpoint, when you're leading yourself, this is when you're understanding your own values and culture, establishing credibility and leading with purpose. When you're talking about leading others, this is when you're coaching and developing others, you're building and maintaining relationships and leading teams. When you're talking about leading managers, you're thinking and acting systematically, managing organizational complexity, negotiating adeptly, and selecting and developing others. Leading the function, strategic thinking, visionary, driving results, and leading the organization, creating and articulating vision. And so when we're thinking about that trajectory, sometimes it's a little bit easier when you're thinking about your professional development to say, this role or this work allows me to lead yourself, but are there opportunities to lead others? Are there opportunities to lead other managers? Lead the function and lead the organization. Now, of course, that red line makes this process look very linear, but that goal is really just to point direction in terms of it being a linear growth and to give some gravity to this type of professional development. Okay, so I want to move us into the last two sections, and that's professional home. So when you think about this professional home, professionals without a doubt identified a Kuho and other professional associations as their place of home. Is where they professionally grow, is where they find community, and it's where they do a lot of their professional development. What was interesting in these interviews is that again, everyone had a different path, but what was clear was many of them found some way to not only identify their professional home, some have more than one. Like me, mine is SHRM, Society for Human Resources Managers, as well as a cool eye. Some had a cool eye and NASPA and ASCA, and that's okay. But what was clear was either in one or all of them, they found time to participate in the conferences, They found time to present. They found time to write. They found time to be in mentor programs. If they weren't doing that, then they were leading as faculty members in Stars College or working for the NHTI Institute. And that didn't just come overnight. If you think back to the mentorship board, some of those opportunities came about because mentors and sponsors and coaches were letting them know that these opportunities were great development opportunities. And so they spent time honing their craft, applying and working on those opportunities or supporting those opportunities. And so growing within your professional home is one of the key indicators that I found in those moving into senior housing officer positions. The other piece was, again, something I pointed to earlier, a number of professionals noted that it can be lonely at the top. And they found support in being able to go to conferences, being able to see some of the same people, trade stories. Matter of fact, it answered a question I could never understand throughout the interviews. So as many of you know, we go to a conference, say a COI, and you know how you always see people hanging out in the hallways. You all know what I'm talking about? People hanging out in the hallways, they're laughing, they're talking. And originally I would think to myself, why aren't these people in sessions? You should be in the session. That's what I would think. And somebody pulled me to the side during one of those conferences, and I pulled them to one of those conversations, and they were talking about how they were honing their skills, or they were catching up, or they were trading stories. They were learning. That's what was happening. They were learning, they were connecting, they were mentoring each other and coaching each other. And so when you talk about your professional home, it is happening in sessions and outside of sessions as well when we think about this. So I just wanted to point that out as we kind of move forward. Now, I want to highlight something that I thought was really interesting that came out, and part of it is a term that I use, and part of it was a theme that I noticed. I want to pause here and focus particularly on these three areas: competencies, professional development, and a professional home. Now, originally, when I was talking to professionals about their path to senior leadership, I didn't quite see the connection here. But over time, as I began to speak to professionals, I was able to see something that they weren't naming directly. And what I mean by that is that many of them had what I call a laboratory or some type of practice space. Let me give you an example. So I was talking to a professional who was telling me about their competencies and wanting to boost their research within housing and residence life. So they were explaining it to me, and they linked it to saying, well, I'm on a research committee, and that's where I get my professional development in COI. So they had decided they wanted to build that as a competency, and they decided the place where they would do that building was in the COI research committee, and so they were doing that, which again was in their professional home. What was interesting, that what was happening for a lot of professionals is that once they found a place to practice, whether it be a committee or a project within their professional home or even in their home institution, they noticed that their ability, their confidence, and their skill set outpace the development that they were receiving on the job. It was making them understand these competencies and have a deeper level of professional development faster. And it was in these laboratory spaces, in these practice spaces, that many of them took a step back and readily admitted that that is actually what helped them along the path to becoming a senior officer, is that even though they use their jobs to develop themselves, and so they made sure that they weren't selecting just a job, that they were selecting competency building opportunities, is that it somehow expedited their growth given the time and attention. A number of us have been on committees where we've spent 10, 20, 30 hours. I found it to be really interesting that a number of these professionals took that time on those committees to use them to build their expertise around things like research and strategic planning, and then applied those things to their job. So this place of having a laboratory, having a practice space often came up in different ways. So I wanted to point that out. Lastly, I want to move to leadership as a brand and talk about this. And so here, there was we'll jump back. There was a particular question that came out when we were talking about competencies, and we talked about diversity and inclusion and equity and social justice in some of these interviews. But what was clear was this question that I wanted to use to really center that conversation, because sometimes you can talk about DE&I work and it sits over here. It was really clear that the central question to this leadership brand could be summed up this way: how competent are you, your campus leaders, faculty, and staff, in creating inclusive campus environments that support the retention and success of the full range of people on campus? A number of professionals talked about, either on their way up or when they got into the role at times, how caught off guard they were by what their leadership brand or their brand of leadership signaled at the intersection of social justice, diversity, and equity. Sometimes it was about the identities that they brought to the table. Sometimes it was about the identities within the organization and them having to fix issues. Some of it was even about their leadership. How do you demonstrate intercultural competence as the head of this organization? How do you demonstrate that your leadership brand is inclusive, and you expect that? So that was something that came up. So I want to give you a snippet of something that I've shared before about effective housing professionals. Intercultural, so effective housing professionals in relation to intercultural competence is the capability to shift perspective and adapt behavior to cultural differences and commonality. This intercultural competence, as people reflect upon cultural differences and commonalities in values, expectations, beliefs, and practices, is at the center of our campus housing work. So our path on becoming a senior housing officer, each position allows us the opportunity to create an inclusive environment where specific differences in your department or institution can be addressed from a mutual adaptation perspective. And so if you don't take anything from that, what was clear was that these professionals didn't wait until they became a senior housing officer to work on their intercultural competence. They made sure that at each step they continued to work and grow it, so they could not only lead themselves, not only lead other managers, but lead the organization in this very intense and purposeful exercise. So here were some questions to consider as I talk to a number of professionals and as I talk to professionals on this track. How do your identities show up in this role and in your work? What does that mean? Really taking that apart, not just assume that, but really taking that apart. What are the qualities that bring you to this position? What does that mean? What personal narratives have led you to do this work? How have you prepared your thinking to make decisions in complex organizations? And lastly, again, how competent are you in your ability to support the retention and success of the full range of people on your campus? These are questions that allow you to interrogate your leadership brand. And I don't mean brand like marketing, but what does it mean when you're moving on your way to become a senior housing officer? And there's a need for an interrogation of how you show up in this place. And so I wanted to highlight that these became some really important sections. So I want to slow down for a second as I kind of bring us to a close and open us up for questions. I want to take us back to what we've talked about. So we started off with talking about starting your path, and have you asked yourself the question, We moved into mentorship, and we talked about this ability to that professionals have used to harness power and harness people around them, if you will, which paid off dividends in not only having barriers removed or glass ceilings cracked, but it also allowed them to have a space where they could feel whole and safe and supported. Then we moved into competencies because having competencies, it was clear that those were the anchors in how professionals move forward. Now, you can't master every single competency in the cool I curriculum. And no one's asking anyone to do that. But it was clear that you have to be willing to invest in you to build and hone your skills, and that this takes time. There are no shortcuts to you becoming an expert in the areas that you've selected. Professional development was key. I know we've talked about professional development many at different points of our career, but this was a little bit different. This was looking at not only professional development in your job, but this was looking at this place of identifying that yes, you have to study, you have to practice. As a matter of fact, one of the things that it might surprise some of you, but one of the things that no one told me in coming into some of these roles was the amount of books and articles I would have to read. I did not realize that the number of articles and books and things that I have to read to keep up on, it can be a lot. It can be overwhelming. And so when you think about that, this is what's happening in that professional development. So there's a study component, there's a practice component, and there's an application component that is coming out that is a little bit invisible. Having a professional home is also where you can expect to lead, volunteer, and contribute. That was, again, a really signature framing in how professionals moved up. They volunteered, they contribute, they were active in building and moving the professional forward. And some of them had one or multiple professional homes. Lastly, they considered and interrogated their own identity and the spaces that they created around them. And so, what message was their leadership sending, if you will? And lastly, if you think about this, a lot of this conversation today, as we agreed on, a lot of this conversation, it has been me trying to positively agitate you around some very specific questions. How do I know that this path for senior leadership is right for me? Who's on your mentor board? Which competencies allow you to lead yourself, lead others, and lead the organization? Have you selected a job or a competency building opportunity? Where can we expect that you lead, that you volunteer, you contribute? And lastly, how competent are you in creating an environment that supports the retention of a full range of students? And so if you don't take anything from this, these small frames give professionals a place to start and a place to consider. And the questions cause what I like to think is positive agitation in some very specific ways. And so with that, I want to leave time for questions. I know we have a number of other professionals on the line. And so we can open it up and maybe you can unmute yourself and we can finish out our afternoon together. And I'll leave that down. All right. Well, I know we have some other scholars on the line. I see Paul. I see Jerry. I see a few of you all. Paul, anything to add? I know if I ask you a question, if I ask you how to tell the time, you'll tell me how to build a watch.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, you have picked up my terminology very well. I guess in an overall comment, I think you've done as we would say, crackerjack job of putting things into a perspective that I think colleagues at whatever level they're in their professional development and their employment history can truly take some gems from what you've shared. Obviously, it's a quick question. Is this part of your dissertation?
No, I'm still working on that. This is
what?
just this is my professional development. It's just me working.
I applaud you, and that's a conversation offline.
Yeah.
Um, no, that's you have really done a yeoman's job of consolidating and personalizing through research and experience a lot of things that I think many younger professionals kind of challenged with trying to get grasp around. So, and I'll leave it at that at this point.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. What about Christine or Demetrius? Any questions or points from you all?
Don't necessarily have any questions. I'm soaking up this information as I'm considering a change myself. I'm looking forward to attending the State of the Profession next week or 2 weeks. So looking to gain some learning there as well.
Yeah, well, congratulations. That is a wonderful and exhausting opportunity. There's a lot of information, very much. Jerry, any points or thoughts from you?
Well, first of all, thanks for letting me participate. It's been great to hear your conversations. And Paul, I just echo your comments about the quality of the job that you did. I think the thing that's probably most on my mind right now is, with this beautiful set of information and model, do you have some suggestions on next steps immediately for the participants? There's, it's, you identified sort of a progression, but, now we've got some momentum going. What are some thoughts about how to start putting some of this stuff into practice?
Yeah, so a lot of that that kind of trajectory I went back to is, I think, even from those interviews is starting with that interrogation, and so in those frames when we think about next steps, part of what I'm hoping people can take back with is that if you look at these areas, beginning to say, for mentorship, where am I? Is it just one mentor? Do I have some other folks? And so I want you all to be able to take this back and interrogate some pieces. So perhaps maybe you thought about competencies softly, or maybe you read them, but has there been an application? If we say, is there opportunity to lead others, to lead managers? And so I think, Jerry, to that point, I'm hoping that that some can take these questions and begin to interrogate their path, based on these areas. Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. Okay. Any others? Caressa, I see you on a call. Any points or things to share before I turn it back over to Meredith?
I guess the only question, and you kind of speak to this as you started in thinking about this invisible conversation. I think sometimes we're challenged to talk about our own professional development if it doesn't directly align with our current roles. And so I guess, what are your tips in how to, if this doesn't align with like your current job functions or kind of how should you approach this conversation with your supervisor or even within your organization?
Yeah, I want to say this the best way I can, and I want to use a word delicately, and the reason I say that is because one of the things that was clear is that depending on the identities of different professionals, the opportunities to kind of step outside one's lane really look different. And so, say for example, you were in occupancy for residence life, but you wanted to do training. Just giving a soft example. It was clear that sometimes the political dynamics or the area didn't allow for that type of cross population. But if we go back to the mentorship board conversation, this is where professionals did find access to places where the dynamics were a little bit different. So I used that professional, for example, who was in residence life in one particular area, but wanted to build up their research skills. They went through a core-I. And so because those dynamics weren't there, they still managed their positions, but they used their professional homes to get into places that didn't have the type of barriers that they did. And I'll use one quick for myself. Very often I tried to sit at the table for human resources and residence life. And I couldn't get there. And I had to work through the profession in other places to gain that experience to eventually be able to shift. And so that was a common approach. Well, with that, I want to give it back to Meredith and respect everyone's time. So Meredith, I'll hand it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shaun. I know for myself that idea of positive agitation it's rattling in my brain now, because I think it's very easy to get caught in the day-to-day, and this is the to-do list and the things I need to accomplish, and forget some of those bigger picture things. And so I think that idea of positively agitating yourself to the next step is a wonderful way to phrase that. Again, I want to thank you, Shaun, for your presentation, and thank everyone that attended today. I am putting in the chat right now a link to our ACU Hawaii networks and committees, and to Caresa's question there about how do you get connected to some different things. Some of our networks and committees really kind of provide an opportunity to branch out from things that you might be doing in your day-to-day in a way that is a little more accessible and often pretty casual. I used always the example of the public policy committee. You know, that is not something that folks maybe get a lot of opportunity to do on their campus, but with that group, they can connect with folks that are doing work around that and learn about different policies across our membership. And so there's some interesting ways to connect, I think, with those networks and committees. So I always encourage folks to get engaged that way. But I also want to be respectful of your time. So I will say again, thank you to Shaun. Thank you to everyone that has been here today. And keep an eye out on our YouTube channel. This will be up in the next week or so. So thank you, everyone.